Living Power with Dan Hurst.
So today I'm going to move right into it because of the time factor. And the next to last gift that's mentioned is the gift of administration. And Romans 12:8 says, if it's leadership or administration, let him govern diligently. Now, isn't it interesting, and you'll see this with the way it's written, that all of the gifts are to be done to the fullest. Whatever your gift is, you are to develop it and to be focused on it and to use it. And so if you have the gift of administration, you are to use it diligently. It's not something that you just kind of decide, oh, I don't feel like I really want to do that. No, if God's given you that gift, you have a responsibility to use it. You should be using it. We need you to use it. So your gift is really critical to us. And if you don't use it, then you are not only failing and sinning, you are hurting the body of Christ. So use your gift. The definition of the gift of administration is that it is the motivation to coordinate the activities of others for the achievement of common goals. Now remember, we're talking about this in the context of the Word, of spiritual matters. These are spiritual gifts. So when we talk about this idea of spiritual gifts of administration, we're talking about coordinating the activities, the spiritual activities of others for common goals, to achieve things as within the body of Christ, or through the body of Christ as it be. The perfect example of that is Nehemiah. Here we are studying Nehemiah, but boy, if there was anybody who had the gift of administration, it was Nehemiah. He was an administrator. And so we're going to take a look in Nehemiah at a number of examples, and these are the characteristics. There's 9 characteristics that are mentioned about Nehemiah that we can discover about the gift of administration. And the first is that a person who has the gift of administration has an ability to understand cause and effect as it relates to spiritual and behavioral matters. Now, just because somebody is an administrator, and there are a lot of secular administrators, nothing wrong with that. The world needs those. We need people like that also sometimes in our lives. But from a spiritual standpoint, a person who has the gift of administration understands the correlation for the spiritual and behavioral matters. So it's important that a person who has the gift of administration understands that what they're dealing with is spiritual issues, spiritual matters, and coordinating those ministries and the effect of people's gifts and ministries. And Nehemiah, it goes on, and right at the very beginning in chapter 1, and we see about his understanding. He had this perspective of cause and effect and how it related to spiritual matters. And he's talking, and his brother comes to him and tells him what's going on back in Jerusalem, that the temple isn't being built. And he says in verse 3, those who survived, Hananiah says, and those who survived the exile are back in the province, and they're in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, its gates have been burned with fire. When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. I just said that the temple had been built. The temple had been built by this point. Ezra saw to that. But now the wall around it had broken down and had been burned. They were burning the gates because they were being attacked. The enemies had burned the gates. And so Nehemiah recognizes that the job hasn't been finished. And so he's really upset about that. And he says in verse 7 that, he's praying in verse 7. And he says to God, we have acted very wickedly toward you. We've not obeyed the commands, decrees, and laws that you gave your servant Moses. And so he understands that this failure has a cause and effect. That because they disobeyed God, it would have consequences. And a person who has the gift of administration understands that and sees that. And by the way, I think it also includes an ability to identify leadership failures and success. A person who has the gift of administration understands and sees failure in a whole different perspective. They can see failure differently. I don't have the gift of administration. I wish I did. I say I wish I did. I wish I had all of them. I guess we do to some degree, maybe a little bit. But I'm not an administrator. But a person who has the gift of administration can see failures and understand failures in a whole different perspective. And it's interesting when you start talking to people in churches where there have been failures in the church, in the ministry of the church or of some sort, there's been a failure. And immediately people's perspective gives you some great insight as to what their spiritual gift is. Because people who have the gift of administration see the failure as a spiritual issue, obviously, but they understand it, and they understand how it happens and how to correct it. Whereas a person like me sees a failure and we're going, yeah, what'd you do? Well, how'd you mess up? We blame people, or I blame myself. You know, that's the way we are. That's the way kind of prophets are. People who have the gift of mercy have a whole different attitude about failure. So it's interesting. A person who has the gift of administration sees failure and understands it from a perspective of how to overcome the failure to reach success. So he doesn't see failure as abject, the end of the road, but rather sees it as, all right, here's a bump in the road. This is how we get around this bump and move on to our goal.